You're on mute. Or is it just me? Can anyone hear her?
No, I can't hear Masuma either.
Yeah. Hmm.
Hi.
I'll text her as well. Oh, interesting.
Did
So
you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Perfect. I was talking for myself then.
Let's start from the top.
I'm sure it was brilliant.
Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Welcome and thank you for joining the Leaders in Global Development Series conversation with Ambassador Jeff Bleich. This event is hosted by Harvard W3D Women in Defense, Diplomacy and Development and Harvard Alumni for Global Development, HAGD. My name is Ma'soumeh Khandan, the secretary at Harvard W3D, and I'm pleased to moderate this conversation with Ambassador Bleich, a distinguished professional with an illustrious career in law, diplomacy, and public service. Before we begin, we would like to go over some housekeeping notes to be mindful of throughout the session. On the bottom of your screen, you will see a Q&A button. Audience members will have the opportunity to ask questions toward the end of the program. So please feel free to use the box to input any questions you may have. You are also welcome to engage with the event's participants using the chat box also located at the bottom of your screen. Please note that this session is being recorded and will be available to view after the event. We will share with you on how to view the recording following the session. Please be sure to stay connected with W3D and Harvard on social and HAGD on social media on our website at harvard.3w3d.com and at Harvard globaldevelopment.sigs.harvard.edu. I correct myself, globaldevelopment.harvard.sigs.harvard.edu. To stay up to date with upcoming events and workshops throughout the remainder of the year. I would like to take a moment and thanks HAGD President Zaina and W3D President Theo for their support in making this event happen. Also, your participation is much appreciated. All right, let's get started. Now it's my honor to introduce our guest, Ambassador Jeffrey Bleich. Ambassador Bleich has an outstanding career in law, diplomacy, and public service. His legal career has included serving as a special counsel to President Obama at the White House, a special master for the USCC court-appointed federal mediator, trial and appellate counsel, adjunct professor of law, and a managing partner of 2 international law firms. In addition to the legal and business roles, he served as the 24th ambassador to Australia from 2009 to 2013, and prior to that, He was a partner for 17 years at the law firm of Munger, Tolles and Olson LLP in San Francisco, where he specialized in high-stakes technology litigation. Currently, Ambassador Bleich is the Chief Legal and Policy Officer at Cruise LLC, an autonomous tech company offering driverless taxi services in San Francisco, Austin, and Phoenix, with several other US cities coming online soon, such as Dallas and Houston. In addition of his services, Ambassador Bleich has received some of the nation's top honors, including highest awards for a non-career ambassador by the US State Department, the US Navy, and the US Director of National Intelligence. In 2009, the city of San Francisco named a day in his honor. Ambassador Bleich, thank you for joining us.
No, I'm delighted to join you. Thank you for having me, Ms. Silma. I just wish my kids had heard that introduction. I think I'll need to invite them the next time.
You can play the recording.
Yes, that's a good idea.
Okay, I start with the first question. You have a very distinguished career in law, diplomacy, and public service. What was the motivation for you wanting to join and remain in this field?
Yeah, well, so that's a good question. It wasn't an obvious path. I was born on an army base, and my dad was serving in Germany at the time in the U.S. Army, and so I, bounced around a little bit. Grew up on the East Coast in I think the worst house in the best school district my parents could find, and so it wasn't clear that I'd be an ambassador one day or doing some of the jobs I've had. I think it was more than anything. I tend to be curious, and I wanted to understand how the world worked. And the more curious you are, the more issues and opportunities you discover, and then you just start following that path. And what I found was that I was always attracted to solving problems, and the bigger and more complicated the problem, the more attractive it became to me. And so diplomacy is sort of the most challenging issues at a global scale. And so I guess that's what led me there. But it's not as though I, as a child, imagined that I'd be in that role. It was more just listening to that inner voice, and I guess having a really undisciplined set of passions.
Thank you for your answer. What are some highlights of your career, or what are some key initiatives you have undertaken, and what would you consider your main achievements so far?
Yeah, that's an interesting question too. I mean, as I said, I've had a lot of interests and a lot of different careers in the course of one career. So I've worked probably in government maybe about half the time, and in the private sector about half the time. Worked at the state and local level, done a lot of work in nonprofits. So it's hard to choose what is, what's the thing that gave you the greatest satisfaction. And if you pick achievements, it'd be 39-year marriage, and kids who still want to spend time with me. And I think probably some of the pro bono cases that I did, things that didn't pay the bills, but just were done because they were the right thing to do. I think probably teaching, and I was on the Cal State University board, and being able to influence other people's lives, hopefully in a positive way. Those are things. If you want to sort of look at like the big things, like as ambassador, what was your most important achievement? I don't know. I kind of think of that's a hard question too, because it's like a marriage. If you can pick like the best thing you did in your marriage in a particular year, probably not a good sign. But it's all the little things that you do together. And I thought of my career as ambassador as constantly being attentive to a whole range of issues and making sure that, I was advancing the interests of the U.S. and its allies in those. Probably the most important from an objective point of view would be our rebalance to Asia. While I was there, we made a number of significant moves. And they fit into the three different categories of, diplomacy and defense and development. Economically, we were advancing the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which ended up tying together all of these important friends and allies in one economic deal, except for us. The Trump administration stepped away from that agreement, but the agreement went forward basically without us. And it was a very important way of improving opportunities for development and economic growth in the most dynamic area in the world. There was a diplomatic component to it. There had been this kind of, alphabet soup of different organizations that were, I think, underweight in terms of their ability to advance a comprehensive set of diplomatic goals in the Asia Pacific, and both through a development of, Indo-Pacific Economic Forum and development of some leaders level meetings, as well as the reinvigoration of APEC. We were able to, I think, apply more structure and strengthen the relations among the U.S. and nations in the Asia Pacific. And then, on the defense side, we really changed our footprint and rebalanced from a European and Atlantic Ocean focused laydown of our forces to one which was much more Pacific focused. We went from, I think, a 60-40 split to a 50-50 between the Atlantic and the Pacific. And we also started laying down strategic defense agreements and cooperative agreements in the Asia Pacific. And I could go into detail on those if people have questions about them. But that was, and we announced that rebalance from Australia. President Obama came out. It was one of my main assignments as ambassador, and it was good to be, a part of what I think was recognition that this is, the most dynamic, most challenging, and in many ways, one of the most critical areas for U.S. attention in this next century. I think the other achievement would probably be, I have a center in Australia that's focused on making sure that digital technologies support and enhance democracy and humanity as opposed to overwhelming them. I think it's kind of a jump ball right now. And part of the reason why I'm working at a major tech company that's doing, AI, machine learning, is because of precisely that. I think, it's not going to be done by government at this point. It'll be done more in the private sector. So an opportunity to be part of that effort as well. So those, I guess those would be highlights. Sorry if that long answer, but
Nice, thank you. You mentioned about some international works that you did. How do you overcome challenges that arise when the bilateral relations between your home country and the country you work in are intense, like you have to choose one way or another?
Yeah, well, it's the U.S. and Australia, it's always, daggers drawn. We hate each other, and it's amazing that I kept us from war with Australia. So I take a lot of credit for that. No, it's pretty easy duty negotiating with Australians. We have probably one of the best, most trusting relationships of any two nations in the world. So you don't develop a lot of skills in bilateral relationship with Australia in terms of how you overcome hard challenges. Generally, you just do it with beer. But in the world as a whole, we work very closely with Australia as a partner around the world. So I was in Afghanistan, where we had joint command of Orazgan province after the Dutch stepped away from that conflict. I was in Fukushima because we contributed water cannons to help cool down the second reactor and hopefully avert at that time what we worried would be a nuclear meltdown. I was in Rarotonga working on sea level rise, and in Indonesia working on nuclear trafficking. In other countries working on trafficking in humans. So there were some big challenging issues that we worked on together that required some difficult negotiation. I chaired the Fulbright board, and we had hard issues in many countries, particularly in the previous administration, that required some delicate diplomacy. I think it's going to sound like a cop-out, but I think the most important way to overcome challenges is to listen. One of the hardest things, I think, for diplomats is to speak less and listen more, because you're not learning anything while you're speaking. So those ideas are already in your head. You're only learning when you're paying attention to other people and caring about them, like really, really caring about who they are and what motivates them and what they care about and what the incentives are that you have at your disposal, and timing that may exist and other opportunities, to find that one breakthrough, that one moment where you can change the trajectory of a conversation. So for me, it was just listening and also recognizing the person across the table from you is a human being. And if you tap into that humanity, you're going to find some way to connect.
Interesting. Listening and connecting with people, no matter who they are.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing this lesson with us. And talking about like what you mentioned, you did lots of jobs in different countries. In the area of global development, like Indonesia, you talked about Indonesia and Pacific countries. What questions do you think that are valuable to ask at all times? And what are key issues to focus on nowadays?
Yeah. I think the one question that people often fail to ask, and I learned this from Warren Buffett, who, started Berkshire Hathaway and is one of the world's wealthiest people, but also an incredibly thoughtful person. So the question that most people forget to ask is, and then what? Right? You come up with some idea that you think is the answer, and you're like, I'm a genius, and you just want to go ahead with that. And what you don't think about is, well, how's everyone else going to react to that? And what are their options, and how do they react to things generally, and what can you predict about it? And it may be more than one thing could happen. And what are you going to do in response to those? And just that second, third, fourth order thinking is where people make mistakes, because you can make one right decision in the moment after another and come out in a very wrong place.
Yeah.
I think so that I guess that would be the most valuable question to ask. And if I gave you more other questions to ask, you just forget that one. And it's better to remember one than forget 5.
And what are key issues to focus on in global development?
Look, I think there are a lot of key challenges to focus on. The biggest problem, though, is how we manage them, given the pace at which technology is moving and the pace at which things happen in society now. We've always had change. It's a normal part of human experience, but we haven't had it at this rate in a way that compounds on each other so dramatically. So we're kind of at this stage now where we we're always working on yesterday's problem while a new one is emerging, and I think people start to feel overwhelmed and a little bit helpless, and that's a very dangerous thing, particularly for democracies. So I think being able to find a way to bring our technology into line with our values and to give people a framework and hope is really the biggest challenge, because you can solve any problem as long as you have people of goodwill with a system in place, trying to execute together. That's been the history of society. I think our biggest problem right now is, I'd say, we have sort of this runaway technology and kind of walk away government. The government's like, I don't understand it. I don't know how it polls. I don't know how I get elected, taking a position on it. Hopefully someone else can figure it out for us. And that has not ever been a solution or a good solution. It's usually ended up in tears. So I think that's the key challenge. The key challenge is applying our technology in a way that advances society as opposed to overwhelming it, and identifying the systems that have been weakened in decision making and helping shore those up. Democratic systems and the systems of international agreements, for example, like climate change, that we should have much greater success at brokering.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing your experience with us in this area as well. So what do you think are key challenges in addressing these issues?
I think that's, it's really the two challenges. One is the people who are generally in power right now did not grow up as digital natives. This is not the world that they necessarily understand or that they're particularly skilled at. But the baby boomer generation is a pretty. I'm a boomer. I'm the tail end of it. It's a pretty stubborn and kind of arrogant generation that believes that no one else could possibly solve these problems, and we need to hang in till the bitter end. You just see a lot of leaders in there, who are convinced that you don't need to understand digital technologies and live in that world in order to make good decisions. I think it's it would be like in the 1920s if all of our leaders were farmers and none of them had any idea about industrialization. The U.S. would have been in a much worse position. I think we're in a similar inflection point where technology is driving massive change in the way we live and how we can plot out our future. So getting people who are entering their careers to focus on government and focus on these issues of development and defense and diplomacy, and but also just stepping up and being citizens and being engaged, and not just saying the government is the problem. It's never the solution, or government is too slow and bureaucratic. I'm going to go where the action is. We need good governance. Every good society has a kind of a harmony between its private sector, its public sector, its academic sectors, its nonprofit sectors, and if they're working together, you get amazing achievements like Silicon Valley. And if they're not working together, you generally have serious conflict areas that diplomats and others are called into.
Yeah, and you mentioned that there's a gap between technology progress and what the government does. Why do you think that's the case?
Yeah, I think part of it is, as I said, I think a lot of leadership just doesn't think in those terms. It's very hard You know, uh, you, there's a great line by Robert Frost. He said, someone asked him what poetry was, and he said, poetry is what's lost in translation. There is, you can, you know, try to analogize the way things are done in the digital world to the way they're done in the physical world, and you know, other revolutions of the past. But it's truly a different language with its own nuance, and drawing analogies will only get you so far. You actually have to learn the language. So I think there's that element of it. You have too many leaders who don't have that background. I think the second thing is we've spent the last 50 years in the West telling people in democracies that government is bad, and that it's full of corrupt people, and that it never solves any problems, and it's just a big waste. And I remember, here's an analogy. There was this, I heard Tom Friedman tell the story of when there was a ad campaign. Most of you are too young to remember this, between Burger King and McDonald's, and they were going after each other and spending unheard of amounts of money trying to gain prominence over the other. And at one point, Friedman was going around trying to understand why they were in this advertising war, and he asked the head of marketing at Burger King, he's like, so why do you know, doing all this stuff to build up the image of Burger King, why don't you spend a little money the way politicians do and just tear down McDonald's and point out, you know, make fun of their burgers and say they're tasteless or whatever. And the head of Burger King looks at me and goes, oh, no, you never do that. You never kill the category. But we've been killing the category of government, and both sides have found that it is it plays well to the public. And both sides like the idea of believing that the other side is full of incompetence and the government is falling apart because of them. But eventually people start to believe it. And once you dry up support for government, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So I think that is one of the big challenges, is getting people to recognize the government isn't some entity out there in the ether that's been imposed on you. That's how it used to be before democracy came around. You have a voice, you have a say, you can change things, and people have repeatedly throughout our history. But you have to believe you can in order to take that first step.
Great. You talk about people. Some may know about the hard skills to succeed within a career in diplomacy, but it's not so clear to most about the soft skills needed. What would you say have been some of the soft skills you acquired that help you succeed in this field?
Yeah. Well, I think as I was getting at earlier, it's some of the softer skills are the listening skills. There has been, I think, one of the groups supporting this is women in defense, diplomacy, and development. And when I look back on my leadership team, you don't actually get to select your leadership team as ambassador. They all come from different places, but over time, people emerge within your organization who become influential. And I'd say in many cases, the most influential people in my embassy, and the ones I listened to the most and sought out their advice were women, because they had what people would tend to refer to as softer skills. They tend to be more attentive in meetings, pay attention to not only what was being said, but who was saying it, how others were reacting, intonation, the body language of folks. They listened very carefully. They weren't there weren't like sort of strange pride and like I'm not going to take notes because I'm not a note taker. People would take notes, and I would often find that after a meeting, it was the women who had the best insights and the best ability to cut to the heart of an issue in a way that some of my other colleagues were missing. So I think there is those skills were traditionally I think underappreciated and underutilized, and I think the diversification of the diplomatic corps and the foreign service has been vastly improved. That has vastly improved the quality of the work that they do. I think another sort of softer skill is humor. These tend to be pretty intense environments, and you need to be able to find a way to kind of step back and kind of puncture some of the tension at critical moments. I had I'll give you one quick story. When I was in Canberra, WikiLeaks broke, and there had been a whole series of cables that were released that had my predecessor saying some negative things about a person who was now the foreign affairs minister, and was responsible for maintaining the relationship with the United States, Australia's closest partner, and it had and really kind of ugly statements about being a megalomaniac and arrogant and narcissistic and those sorts of things. And so I had a meeting coming up with the media on another subject, and we knew that there was more than the usual interest, because suddenly like CNN trucks are backing up on the lawn of the embassy, and so and a huge crowd was gathering, and I don't think it was because they wanted to hear me talk about the actual issue, which was domestic violence in the Pacific Islands and what we were doing on that subject, even though it was a critical subject. What they wanted to hear about was the stuff that was on the ticker at the bottom of the news. So we're sitting around, and I'm talking to my team before I go out to face the microphones. They're like, well, what are you going to say? I'm going to say, well, yeah, I get along very well with the foreign minister. He's been a great partner, and and you've probably seen the two of us walking around the lake together, having conversations. We got a little bromance going on. And one of the people in the room said, I will buy you a case of beer if you say bromance. And another person was like, 2 cases. And I thought, if you want to get rid of the words like megalomaniac and narcissist and arrogant and replace it with a different word, maybe you should say bromance. So I got out there, basically said, we're having a bromance. They confused some people that maybe I was having an affair with the foreign minister, but otherwise, it completely diffused it. And suddenly, the word of the week in Sydney was bromance, and that's what was on the ticker on cable news. And a little bit of humor took a lot of the sting out. So that should not be underestimated. Nope. I think you're having microphone issues again.
Thank you for sharing your story with us. So humor and listening are 2 most soft skills that you think we need to be in diplomacy field.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's it. Being more attentive and being willing to be vulnerable, be authentic, have some humor.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So before we move on, taking questions from the audience, could you please advise women in the audience who are seeking to begin a career in global development?
Yeah, oh, I'd be glad to. As I said, I've had an extraordinary experience working with the State Department. I've held a number of roles there now, in addition to serving as ambassador, and have been consistently impressed with women leaders in diplomacy, development, defense, in various capacities. I'd say I've already talked about just being true to yourself. Some things which have been traditionally defined as feminine. I don't think they necessarily are that way. They've just been defined that way. But whether they're feminine or not, just be yourself. In the internet age, we've all grown up with this notion of having kind of real-time exposure to how people behave in the moment. There was a period of time where we got our understanding of how people acted based on how they recounted what they had done, or based upon a story that was crafted later by third parties or a film. But we rarely saw how people actually behave in the moment. And it's only been in the last 20 years where every single person is now a reporter and can not only record things happening in real time, but then put it on the internet so it can be seen all over the world. And that's how people are consuming most of their information now. They won't take the secondhand version or the third mediated version. They want to know who you really are, what you really believe, what kind of person you are. And so the days of spending 2.5 days writing a press release and then standing up and reading it in a monotone, you're not going to get a single eyeball. You're not going to influence a single person doing that. You've got to be prepared to speak in the moment and be genuine, and be vulnerable. The only way you build trust is not by telling people to trust you, it's by trusting them not to take advantage of you. And that requires a certain amount of vulnerability. Once they see you do that, they're like, okay, this person trusts me. I'm going to give them a little bit of trust too. That's the trick that is required in this media environment, in this world. I think women not feeling like they have to do it the way men have traditionally done it is the wisest course. Do it the way you would do it. One of my favorite people on earth is Samantha Power, who was our permanent representative to the United Nations, or ambassador there. She's also heading up USAID. I go back with her 25 years working on human rights work together. And she's always done it her own way. She didn't start out aspiring to those lofty goals. She got her hands dirty, and she worked on difficult human rights issues. She wrote books that were controversial. She won a Pulitzer Prize. She gained some attention. She supported people who were long shot candidates, but who shared her values. And she's been able to achieve extraordinary things, I think, in this world, by being authentic, being independent, being very values-based, and not allowing people's preconceptions about how diplomats are supposed to behave define her.
Ambassador Bleich, I acknowledge you for who you are and for what you have done for this world. Thank you so much.
I see you too.
Thank you. So we can take some questions from audience.
Oh,
I'm happy to jump in with a question. So, so one question that I have is a lot of, and also it's very nice to meet you. My name is Theo, and I'm the board president of W3D. So thank you for these incredibly insightful comments and like very inspiring. history and work that you do now. And actually, like you, I have had some experience, the less experience, both on the geopolitical side and also in the technology side. I was working recently at Twitter until I got laid off. And before that, I was working in the intelligence community for the US government. So my question is, a lot of us are trying to figure out our own next steps. This is a time of incredible uncertainty, and there are a lot of opportunities, but also many different directions that we can turn to. And so I was wondering if you can advise, based on the very diverse experiences that you've had professionally, specific parameters that you think about when you're deciding on your next steps. How do you go about delineating between the very many interesting options that are out there across the geopolitical, diplomacy space, and also the technology space to and government, private sector? You said you worked across sectors as well. Like, how do you make those difficult political, professional decisions?
So I think everyone does it a little bit differently. I can only offer what I've done, because I think my approach has been a little bit unconventional, or at least when I tell people I do things this way, they look at me as though maybe I'm a little crazy. But I've never been particularly impressed with people based on titles or wealth. I know what I care about is what they do. So there are people who want to be something, and there be something. There are people who want to do something, and I've just cared about doing things. So I didn't care what the title was. I didn't care what it paid. If it was a righteous cause, and I thought I could add value in a way that others might not be able to, that I could actually have meaning, then I was attracted to it. And the standard that I use for every project is, I'd say reduced it to the same letter so I could remember it. It was people, purpose, and passion. So who are the people I'm going to be working with on this? Because doesn't matter how good an idea is. If you're with the wrong people, they're going to screw it up. But on the other hand, it doesn't matter how weak the idea is. If you're with really good people, they'll figure out a way to make it work. So the people are really ultimately most important. The purpose has to be one that you believe is a righteous one, and that fires you up and makes you want to do it every day, even when it's going to be hard, and even when people don't necessarily understand it. And then the passion for me is like, well, what are the things that I'm particularly good at, that I kind of light up when I'm doing them, and I can make a real contribution? I'm good at some things. I'm terrible at other things. I try and audit myself regularly. And on the things I'm not good at, I try and, make sure I'm working with people who are good at those and want to do them. And then I look at the things where I can make a contribution. And if it really calls for that, then those are the jobs I'm attracted to, because I know I'll be carrying my weight. And then I guess the last piece of advice is the advice that I've given all three of my kids, which was, they wanted to know what, same thing, like what should I do? And I was like, three things: be honest, don't be mean, and be useful. If you do those three things, you'll be an asset to any organization you join.
I'm definitely going to remember that. Thank you. Very helpful.
Oh, you're welcome.
Ralph, you can speak up.
Yes, Jeff, I'm impressed with your skills. I'm a retired physician and 89 years old, and you can look back and see the complications that internationally, personally, and the rest. But I'm impressed with your emphasis on the human side and exercising goodwill. How do you deal with people who do not have goodwill?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are two ways. So in areas where I don't need to engage with people who are toxic, I just don't. There's no real. I think some people just don't have boundaries in their lives, and they end up with too much of their time soaked up by people who, you know, aren't going to improve them or the world. So really, you know, in those spaces where you can control, like who I go out to dinner with on a Saturday night, you know, I try and have people who I admire and who make me want to be better. Not people who I'm, you know, struggling to find their value. But then there are these other cases where you actually do. It's your job. You've got to work with difficult people and people who don't have goodwill. And in some cases, you know, I've had to work with people who were ruthless dictators and violent and messianic. I mean, really, really dangerous folks. And you know, not always in diplomacy, sometimes in a legal matter. So you get these, and in those cases, what you have to do is you have to check your own impulse to judge, and instead sort of assess who they are, where they are, what is that thing that motivates them. Even the worst people don't wake up in the morning looking in the mirror and saying, I'm an awful human being. There's something about what they do that allows them to justify behavior that they know is condemned by others. And so what is that? And then once you can identify what everyone's either the hero or the victim in their own personal story. You know, they're never the villain. So I try and figure out what makes them believe they're heroic, what makes them feel as though they've been victimized. And I can try and express sympathy with how they feel like a victim. And I can also identify a way in which, you know, the objective that I'm hoping we can achieve will make them feel heroic. Sometimes it's by letting them, you know, there's, I can't remember, it was like in the King and I, where basically you tell a leader that the greatest power is the power of grace. And if you're truly powerful, you're gracious to your enemies and you show mercy, because that's the ultimate power move. If you can, you know, tap into their vanity or whatever it is, and help them feel heroic by doing the thing that they ordinarily wouldn't do, that's how you can have an impact on them.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We have another question is, what is your greatest professional regret?
And my greatest professional regret?
Yeah, month and
Um,
put it in the chat.
That's a very good question. I tend not to spend a lot of time thinking about, I think about learning from things that didn't go the way I wanted, but I tend not to regret them. But in terms of what I might have done, I probably earlier in my career wrote too much and said too much. And that means that in the current environment, it's a lot harder to get you know, to navigate some of the politics. And you know, it was a miracle that I, you know, was confirmed unanimously as ambassador. It must have been just a day when people weren't paying attention. But you know, going through the process now and the expectations that we have for people, I think if you're intellectually curious, you're going to see both sides of an issue, and you'll write about how this side has some validity and that side has some validity, and here's where I come out. In this environment, you can't ever give credit to the other side. So I probably would have taken my own advice that I gave earlier, which is I would have thought, okay, I'm going to write this and it'll feel really good to put this out there. And then what? Is it going to influence people, or is it just going to hamper me? I probably would have been a little bit more judicious. But do I regret it? No, I've learned from it.
Nice. And any other questions?
If no one has anything, I'd like to chime in. This was a fascinating discussion, so thank you. And Matsuma, you raised a great point during the Q&A about soft skills. And everyone here is a leader or wants to become one. It's why we're all here. One thing that I've learned personally is that soft skills, leadership is 90% soft skills, right? And then you had mentioned something about how sometimes leadership can be dangerous. And I wanted you to expound upon that. What do you think it is that takes people off from being a good leader to being dangerous? Because there's a very fine line as it relates to that. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think one of the moment that you start thinking of your job as a title and a right and an entitlement, as opposed to it's your job, I think that's where you lose the plot. And I see a lot of people who start out entering into leadership and positions of authority who seem good. But the old saying about power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. It's not necessarily corruption the way we think about it. It's not, I want to get the most money, and so I'm going to ignore it's this, I don't need to listen to anyone because everything I think is right. And, this person is my friend. They've stood by me. I'm going to stand by them the way any friend would, but I have all these special, public authorities. I should use those, whatever's at my disposal, I've earned, and I should be able to use it any way I want. It's, people tend to be more corrupted by friendship, frankly, than by other things. But it all comes back to this notion of entitlement and that it's about you. It's whereas if you remember every day, I'm doing service to others. My job is intended to benefit them. It's not about me. Then you never lose that. You never lose the thread. I work very closely with President Obama, and I know we're in a polarized and politicized world. It's hard for people to see good in folks that they might disagree with politically. But even some of his harshest critics would say, Obama was never in it for his self-glorification. He took his job really seriously. He thought about it as a job every day. And you could hear it in how he spoke and how he debated hard questions and the decisions that he made. You could disagree with the decisions, but what was driving him, I think it's hard to find fault with them. So I look for people like him, in terms of the approach to problem solving, the approach to not allowing leadership to go to your head and change who you are.
Wow, thank you. Like you said lots about adaptive leadership that we learn at Harvard. Thank you.
Oh, no.
If we don't have any more questions, we can end with any comments, notes, thoughts at the end.
Yeah, no, I think first, Ralph, thank you for sharing time. I think a lot of times we don't appreciate the wisdom that comes with those years, and thanks for all your service to your patients. It's a really noble way to live a life. So thanks for that. And for everyone else who's, actively engaged in these organizations, thank you for caring and taking, an hour out of busy days to think about ways to help advance the world and on these important dimensions: diplomacy, defense, development. It's just whenever I get a little tired, it gives me hope when I meet people like you all who are committed to doing good in the world.
Mr. Bleich, I have
So thank
one
you.
question.
You're welcome. Thank you so much for the acknowledgement. Sandeep has a question. You can ask the last one.
As per the Australia and USA, if we compare, means what kind of leadership difference do you see generally in the people in Australian people and USA people? You know, there can be certain mindset changes among the people of Australia, among the people of I'm talking about general people, means leadership mindset. What
Yeah,
is the basic difference that you generally see between Australian and USA or USA people? What is the
I
basic
saw.
difference? It cannot be
Yeah, no, it's a very good
wholly
question.
different. Is it?
Yeah, no, it's a very good question. I saw a couple of key differences. One was the way they elect officials tends to reduce polarization. There are still differences, but as I explained to President Obama when he was coming out to visit, you know, they were bitterly divided between, you know, Labor Party and liberal National Coalition. And I said the Labor Party is a little bit like our Democrats, and the Liberal National Coalition is a little bit like our Democrats. You know, they're like the difference between progressive Democrats and blue dog Democrats. But part of the reason why they don't have the extremes there in their politics generally is everyone has to vote. They have mandatory voting. And that forces politicians who want to get elected to speak to the middle, which is where most people live, as opposed to simply trying to rally their base. So I've become a fan of universal voting because I think it does change the nature of leadership. We have too many people who get elected and think my job is to represent my base and to support some of the Americans. It's like, no, you know, maybe you campaign based on the support of some Americans, but once you're elected, you need to govern on behalf of all Americans. And I think that's more baked in Australia to some extent than I saw here, at least recently. And I think some of it is the electoral system. The other thing is there was a you know, I think the humor element that I was talking about earlier, there was a notion that you can you take your work seriously, but don't take yourself too seriously. And as long as people are willing to make fun of themselves and be vulnerable, you can have a real conversation with them. If they think they're perfect and they you know aren't open to even acknowledging anything that could be improved in them, really hard to you know have a meaningful conversation because there won't be a give and take. There'll only be a take. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. We
Yeah.
have 1 minute. Thank you so much
Okay.
for your time and for being here
Good.
and
Thank you.
for giving this opportunity that we could learn from your experience and your thoughts.
No. Yeah. No, well, thank you. It really was. My days are generally pretty full, and every once in a while you need an hour of inspiration. And seeing you all and hearing the questions, it's you did more for me than I did for you. So thank you.
Thank you. Have a good evening, afternoon, morning, whatever. Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
Yeah. Bye-bye.